Welcome back, everybody. My name is Grace, or Gibby, and I've been thinking a lot about Jujutsu Kaisen lately. So much so that 4 nights ago, I got out of bed and wrote 2 illegible pages on white paper without lines, which was rough for my handwriting, but on what might or might not happen to Gojo and why. And today I wanted to share those thoughts with all of you in an easy to digest sort of discussion, ramble, presentation, chat, citing some juicy manga chapters, and theorizing how every possible fight might go down. If you're an anime viewer, have a great time. You've got a great season 2 coming up. If you're a manga reader, make sure you're up to date as of March or May 2023, because I'm going to drop some bombs if you haven't caught up yet. So, let's get started. The goal of this video is to make sure and figure out whether or not Gojo can take Kenjaku, can Gojo take Sukuna, and finally, can he fight them both at once? This is a pretty open-ended topic. Some people might say he's only going to fight Sukuna, and based off the most recent chapter, this hype-up chapter, chapter 222, that does seem possible, but I find it hard to believe that Kenjaku would leave his strongest opponent's death up to a fight where he's completely absent. So I really do think it's going to be a 3-way battle, or a 2-on-1, at least in some way, in some degree. Either way, there's been a ton of fun discussion on YouTube and on other mediums, Reddit already, but I wanted to throw my 2 cents in since I think there's a lot of factors that could use more careful consideration. To break down what I think might happen, I'm first going to be trying to figure out Gojo's limits. Now everybody knows he's an absolute beast in combat. He has effectively limitless cursed energy thanks to his 6 eyes, a stupidly broken defensive technique that basically makes him untouchable, multiple one-hit kill offensive techniques, a broken ass domain expansion, the ability to teleport seemingly any distance. In theory, he's unbeatable, even against a powerhouse like Sukuna, or something even stronger, for example, Kenjaku with prep time. But seriously, I'm going to start off talking about Gojo's teleportation and why it may or may not have an impact on his battle. The first time we see Gojo teleport is when he fetches Yuji to watch him obliterate Jogo off the face of the earth. This starts with Gojo kicking Jogo, sending him absolutely flying. When Jogo realizes Gojo disappeared, he only has a few seconds to look around before Gojo is back, this time with Yuji in tow. From Yuji's perspective, Gojo just appeared, told him they were heading out, and then suddenly, they're back on the battlefield staring down the mini Fuji. So, in the span of just a few seconds, Gojo got back to school, went into the basement to get Yuji, and came back to the battlefield. We even get an in-universe confirmation that this whole thing took less than 10 seconds, which is just a stupidly quick amount of time, given Gojo even stopped to chat with Yuji before grabbing him. Now, talking about Gojo's teleportation in detail is tricky because it's never been confirmed anywhere that I've actually seen how his teleportation works. The explanation I've seen, like the theory I've seen that makes the most sense, is that Gojo uses his technique to remove the space between where he is and his target location, but I'm not going to spend too much time theorizing since we only have a few examples to work with of him actually teleporting, or at least confirmed examples of him teleporting. Now the next big teleportation scene was it came first chronologically in Volume 0, and this is when he's sending back Panda and Inumaki to protect Yuta, or depending on how mean you think he is, to enrage Yuta. But all he does is draw his little magic circle in the ground, take like 10 seconds to talk, and then they're gone. Just like that. So this is an extraordinarily powerful ability. They got instantly transported to the school. Again, we don't know the mechanism behind this and how many conditions teleporting other people has, but this alone is a stupidly powerful use of teleportation. To my knowledge, these are the only 2 confirmed instances we see Gojo using teleportation. There are some times where he blitzes people, specifically in Shibuya, where it sort of looks like he's teleported, but I can't really use those as evidence since it's a little unclear if he's just teleporting or if he's just like really fast in fights. There's also the fact that when Gojo came out of the prison realm, he was trapped extremely deep under the water. That's like 28,000 feet for you Americans, like myself. Shame. I probably got that wrong. Not relevant. Anyways, he was under immense pressure, like 8,000 meters worth. But he seemingly instantly appeared at Kenjaku's hideout, and he even caused an earthquake that Yuji and the others felt when they were chilling, like getting ready to unleash him. So I think teleportation is the only explanation for how he could have got out of there, but again, there's not enough information to go on, so I can't really use this as evidence. At face value, the teleportation ability is just too powerful to use in a fight and have it be balanced. If I were Gojo and I had this seemingly conditionless ability to teleport, I would scout the area, blinking in and out of their Kenjaku or Sukuna's range, and then once I knew their location, I would just fire off hollow purple techniques in the general direction while teleporting in and out of their attacking range. Even without purple, if he can teleport objects like he can teleport other people, what's to stop him from teleporting a bunch of bombs in front of Sukuna's face? Like, I know that would be a stupid way to end the series, but with unlimited teleportation, there are unlimited possibilities to win a fight. He could even teleport Sukuna to the Mariana Trench, potentially, like Gao or Kenjaku tried to do to him, and that would probably just instantly kill him. Teleportation just breaks the fight. So, since unconditional teleportation is too powerful to write a shonen around, one way or another, his ability will have to be neutralized. In-universe, maybe Kenjaku will have a cursed object that kills Gojo if he moves 500 feet away under some condition, or another cursed object that keeps him from teleporting. Or maybe they'll use a special version of some domain to trap him in place, or at least relatively in place. Both Sukuna and Kenjaku's domains don't have barriers, so they'd have to modify their domain. Maybe it would be a weaker version to account for that. Or maybe there'll be an out-of-universe lore explanation. Maybe Gege, the writer, will either release lore reasons that there are strict conditions behind the teleportation, like he needs to be standing still for a certain amount of time, or doing it more than once depletes even his infinite six eyes cursed energy pool. Maybe Gege will just retcon teleportation, since we haven't seen it in action in more than 200 chapters. Would be a little bit cringe if he did that, but hey, man's gotta do what a man's gotta do. But one way or another, Gojo cannot have full access to teleportation, or else the fight would be decided in his favor before it even starts. Speaking of the fight being already decided, Hollow Purple, Gojo's peak offensive technique, is certainly a huge factor in the upcoming battle. For anyone who hasn't thought about Purple in a long time, since again, we haven't seen it in more than 100 chapters, I always think about how he obliterates half the forest in that one scene in the anime. Or this scene in the manga, when he fires it to scare away or kill Hanami. Again, same scene, but here's the manga image. This was early in the show for a lot of anime viewers, or at least that's how I got into the franchise. Maybe you've been here since day one, good for you. But this scene is just burned into my mind. It was so sick. We also get size context from Yuji and Todo just chilling there. The purple ball was enormous. We're also shown that it nearly one-banged Hanami, which honestly should be obvious from what it did to all the dirt and rock and trees, but just remember that it obliterates living things as easily as it does inanimate matter, as I continue to talk about Purple in these later bits and discussions. The only rough thing when figuring out facts about Purple is that it's kind of like teleportation, and it's very seldom used. There are only 2 times we've seen it activated in the series, once, as you just saw, killing Hanami, and the second time, again, like teleportation, chronologically came first, when he tries to kill Toji. Anyways, I want to remind you all of this sequence where Gojo comes back to life with reverse curse technique, or positive cursed energy, whatever, and starts round 2 with Toji. Me personally, I wouldn't have enough endurance for round 2 with Toji, but that's just me. Okay, seriously, moving on this time. We do learn something important about Purple in this sequence. It's made from Infinity colliding with the forward and reverse rotation techniques, basically combining Infinity, his defensive technique, with red and blue at the same time. So, Purple is a combination of his 3 main techniques. Keep that in mind because it'll be important later when I discuss some potential countermeasures. Another thing we learn in this scene is that Gojo's purple doesn't necessarily have a charge-up time, like it was shown to have in the anime. So the anime might have misrepresented that. The way I know this is in this scene, right before Gojo throws out his purple, Toji actually whips a chain at him, and you can see it in this panel very clearly. Now, this chain probably wouldn't have done any damage to Gojo, but in the very next panel, as you can see, it goes straight to Gojo firing off the purple. Or we pan straight to Gojo firing off the purple, and we don't see the chain bounce off him, or hit him, or affect him, or even come into view. That means that in the time Toji's chain took to move through the air, Gojo was able to fire off a purple technique. So Toji is the strongest physical character we have. You could say that Maki is equally strong, totally fair, but at the time, he was the strongest. And the fact that purple is stronger and faster, more importantly faster to fire off and hit its target than Toji's attack, which was already mid-air, really says something about purple's potence as an offensive tool. Toji can't even dodge it or attack more quickly than it, it's just crazy fast and crazy powerful. And as for the damage of purple, we already know well enough that it can bore through hundreds of feet of rock or easily penetrate the most durable character that we've seen other than Gojo, which is Toji, as you can see. Also, looking at the last panel of the chapter, it almost seems like purple gets bigger the farther it travels. You see the hole in Toji is very small, but the hole in the wall behind him is huge. But we haven't seen it enough times to know that for sure, so I'm not going to pursue that thread too much. Overall though, an unrestrained ability to use Hollow Purple would make Gojo nearly unbeatable if he takes the fight seriously, which we can assume he will. It's in a technique faster and stronger than Toji, and he can make it large enough to obliterate an area that's 4 totos in diameter. Perfectly safe maths here, don't worry about my measuring skills. But because of that, I think that there will be some conditions to limit Purple's use in any given fight. And I actually think there are some reasonable and story-backed reasons for those conditions. 1, Purple might have a cost of some kind. Both times we see Gojo use Purple, the fight is over immediately after, and we don't see him use any cursed technique or cursed energy afterwards. Admittedly, both times the fight was over because he one-banged his opponent, but it's entirely possible Purple sort of overrides his 6 Eyes cursed technique pool, which is like limitless, and it actually drains his cursed energy. So maybe it temporarily depletes him of energy, makes him unable to use his techniques for a short time, sort of like a domain for most sorcerers. Again, there's no evidence to support this, but it's certainly possible, and I can see that being like a realistic condition to balance out Gojo's talent. There's another way, though, that I think is really interesting that Purple could be balanced in a fight, and that is that Sukuna may actually be able to resist it. Why do I think that? From his fight with Yorozu, actually. Sukuna's had a fair few fights after obtaining the 10 Shadows technique, but his fight with Yorozu was pretty interesting. One, we got to see him use some cool-ass Shikigami, but more importantly, for this conversation, we got to see him resist an extremely powerful ability, Yorozu's Perfect Sphere. Now, I'm by no means trying to say Yorozu is anywhere near close to Gojo's level of power, but follow along with some logic here because I think Gege was actually showing us one of Gojo's potential weaknesses with this fight. So we see Yorozu summon this death ball called a perfect or a true sphere, and the narrator starts going off with some shonen BS about how it's a technique to create infinite pressure, but also how it's an impossible thing to create. Now, brush up a little bit on how Gege explains Purple. The expulsion of imaginary mass. I'm reaching a little, but hear me out. Both of these techniques leave a giant-ass hole in the ground, specifically in stone and rock, but that's not too relevant. They both leave a big trail where they've been attacking, and obviously Gojo's is much bigger than Yorozu's. But I really think that Gege was trying to draw a parallel here between these two abilities. Both are described with imaginary or fanciful language, both leave a perfect spherical crater. There's a lot of similarities. Now, the end of the fight just has Maharaga breaking the sphere, which on its own isn't very significant. Everybody knew that Sukuna was going to win this fight, so it's no surprise when he eventually does. What is surprising, though, is that Maharaga was able to block a theoretically unblockable attack. Fortunately, we don't have to speculate, like I have been before, about why this is possible. Sukuna actually just tells us through his trash talking that even though Yorozu created one beastly projectile, because it's a product of her technique, it can't affect him because he'd already been adapting to her technique all throughout the fight with Maharaga's pinwheel. The only tricky thing for me is that I've read quite a few different translations of this exact scene, which I'm about to show you. And because of the differences, I can't be quite sure if Sukuna is saying that he'd adapted to the biomaterial of her technique, the physical qualities it has, or the technique itself. I'd read the source material to find out for myself, but unfortunately, meme speaks for itself. Anyways, more seriously though, Sukuna was able to adapt to either her technique or her biomaterial, and the makeup of her technique, and I can't be sure which, but he uses that adaptation to block and break a supposedly indestructible and unblockable attack. Now, what does all this have to do with Gojo? As we learned earlier, purple is a combination of infinity, red, and blue. So when you put those three techniques together, you get purple. Just like Yorozu's ultimate technique was made up of her weaker bug skin and liquid metal, like solid and form, Gojo's ultimate technique is made up of his defensive infinity and his offensive and utility abilities, red and blue. So what will happen when Sukuna activates his personal pinwheel, like he did in Yorozu's fight? What I think happens is Sukuna trades some punches with Gojo, some blows, some kicks, some hits, whatever. He'll start to adapt to infinity, since Gojo has it on passively, and I find it highly unlikely he'll ever deactivate it against Sukuna, even if he catches on that Sukuna's plan is to do something with his infinity. And I just think he can't turn it off because Sukuna's cleave and dismantle attacks are just too powerful, so he'll need it on to stay alive. So, Sukuna will probably be able to adapt to infinity. Then, Gojo might decide to use red or blue offensively as projectiles, both of which are very strong abilities, but as you can see from Toji taking a red blast to the chest and getting up to flex his pecs, they're not nearly as lethal as purple. So they're not going to kill Sukuna. Knowing that, Sukuna could at least take a couple of these hits from them before going down, which would give him time to adapt to those techniques. So the question is, if Pinwheel Mode Sukuna has adapted to 1, 2, or even all 3 of the techniques that make up Hollow Purple, will he be able to defend against it without dying? Using Yorozu's defeat as evidence, I'm going to say yes. There's a good chance that given enough time to adapt to those 3 specific techniques, Sukuna might be able to even nullify the final technique, Purple, completely. So, even if Gege doesn't reveal any restrictions on the purple ability, like it can only be used once, or it makes Gojo unable to use other techniques, or some other shonen BS reason, Sukuna may still be able to resist it and survive it. As for Kenjaku, I can't say for sure, but he survived this, so I'm not putting anything past that man. He's been around for 1,000 years for a reason. All that being said though, I think that without absolutely perfect circumstances, purple will still cause a problem for Sukuna and Kenjaku. Domains are the next aspect of the fight that I want to analyze. There's something of a doozy, they get a little bit complicated, and there's like 7 different rules. So strap in, get ready, grab a snack if you'd like. We're going in. Now, if there's any way to make this an even fight for Kenjaku and Sukuna without some surprise factor messing up Gojo, or some shonen BS, which is certainly possible, it's domain combat. Now, we've seen Gojo's domain twice. Once where he mops the floor with Jogo, which is honestly just a sick introduction to Gojo's insane power. And the second time was in Shibuya, when he opens it for a fraction of a second to help handle the transfigured humans and accursed spirits. We've also seen Kenjaku and Sukuna's domain, but only once each. Now, Kenjaku's domain, we saw it when he was going to steal Tengen. Rip Tsukumo, by the way, she was a beast. But this domain seems to be second only to Sukuna's, which he opened in Shibuya, and he obliterated 200 square meters of space. He just cut it all into pieces, into nothing. And that was when he was finishing off Maharaga. Both of these domains are described as divine techniques and domains that don't require a barrier, which basically means that they're the peak of domain combat and domain creation. Gojo's domains is by no means anything to scoff at, but it does have a barrier, which means he's a few steps behind both Kenjaku and Sukuna. So, with that fact in mind, that Gojo's domain is less refined and a little bit weaker than Kenjaku's and Sukuna's, I'm going to investigate some rules of domains we've been introduced to over the series. We learned in Jogo's fight that whichever sorcerer has the more polished domain will control that space and have their domain's abilities activated. So, if like Gojo and Jogo, the gap between the two fighters is immense, the one with the stronger domain will have complete control, and the domain's effects will inflict on the other target. Whether it be an auto hit attack or another domain effect, whatever it is, it'll work if their domain is stronger. This is pretty basic, but it means that Kenjaku and Sukuna cannot be trapped in Gojo's immeasurable void, so he won't be able to kill them with his domain because theirs is more refined than his is. It also implies that Gojo himself might be trapped in either of their domains, but I'll talk more about that in a slightly later section. The next rule that I haven't seen anyone talk about is the conditions for a domain or a set of domains to fail. We learned this during Yuta's three-way fight, when all three tried to summon their domains at the same time. While this was going on, the Bug Spirit and Rika were also trying to break in, and the combination of three domains being expanded at once and the two invaders trying to bust in made all three domains collapse at the same time. Notably, all of these domains did have barriers, and Kenjaku's and Sukuna's don't, but I think it's reasonable to assume that if all three fighters expanded their domains at once, like in Yuta's fight, all three domains would collapse. You might ask, why would all three open their domains at once in the first place? I can think of a few situations where they might happen, but it is an idea. It's not guaranteed. There's no foreshadowing to support this that I could find. Obviously, if Kenjaku does really dip out on this fight like he's claimed he would, this circumstance won't happen. There will only be two domains, but I do think it's still important to talk about. The first way I think they all might simultaneously open their domains is if Gojo tries to blitz one of them with a domain expansion. Because Sukuna and Kenjaku are well aware of Gojo's speed and power, they know that they might only have a split second to protect themselves, and they might open their own domains as a countermeasure before they get one-shot by Gojo's immeasurable void. This would result in the three domains being opened in quick succession, which would likely lead to all three collapsing. This might actually be the best case situation for Gojo, since he's likely to lose either 1v1 in a domain fight, since again, his domain is less polished than the other two. Another situation where all three might open domains is if either Sukuna or Kenjaku don't fully trust each other. Now they do have a binding vow, so it's unclear whether this would happen, but we'll have to wait and see. Imagine Gojo opens his domain to attack Sukuna, and then Sukuna opens his domain to neutralize Gojo's domain. If Kenjaku doesn't trust that Sukuna won't backstab him, that is, if he's afraid of Sukuna for one reason or another, he might open his domain to keep Sukuna from killing him. And that would mean that three domains are opening in quick succession, which would cause all three to collapse, again resulting in what's probably the best case scenario for Gojo since his domain is weaker. Now, if this happens, if all three open up their domains, and then they either collapse or close their domains or the domains break, there's another rule of domains that we have to consider, which is that sorcerers don't have control over their technique immediately after their domains have been used. It's unclear whether this will apply to all three sorcerers equally, or if Kenjaku with his age's experience might regain his technique first, or if Sukuna with his super bath powered body or whatever will regain his technique first, or if Gojo with just 6-eye hacks will. But I think in that situation, what will decide the fight is if Gojo or Sukuna recover first. Kenjaku doesn't have that same level of instant offensive technique to instantly decide a fight, at least that we've seen. So if Gojo gets his technique back first, he can probably one-hit Sukuna or Kenjaku with purple, or with another one of his techniques while they can't defend themselves. If Sukuna gets his technique back first, he'll immediately cleave or dismantle Gojo and the fight will end there. There is one factor that could change this situation though, and that's Shikigami stuck outside the domain barrier while the domains are active. If Maharaga or one of Kenjaku's spirits is stuck outside the domains, and then domains collapse, that'll pose a serious threat to Gojo in the time it takes him to recover his technique. That could buy time for Sukuna or Kenjaku to regain their technique or to run away. So basically what I'm saying is, if all three domains are used and collapse, it's anyone's game. There's just too many variables to consider and too many unknowns that we could know ahead of time. So, if We've been on domains for a long time now, but there's one more big situation to consider. What will happen to Gojo if he's locked in one of the two's domains? There are 3 ways to counter a domain that we've seen in the series, specifically domain auto-hit attacks, and the domains from either Kenjaku or Sukuna would probably kill or severely injure Gojo, so he would need to use one of these methods to defend against them if he wanted to survive. The first method is using a simple domain, and the one we've seen the most is the new Shadow style, which we've seen, I think, in like 5 or 6 fights. But essentially, it nullifies the sure hit power of a domain without directly challenging it. You just make a much smaller domain around yourself, and then the sure hit attacks can't hit you. The second method is the Falling Blossom emotion technique, which is something we've only seen once when Naobito used it against Dagon. It seems like basically a stronger version of the simple domain, but it's generally the same type of thing, and we've only seen it once, so I won't go too deep in on it though. What I will say, however, is that a simple domain might not be enough to protect Gojo, and I'd assume Falling Blossom emotion would be basically the same. Tsukumo tried a simple domain against Kenjaku, and she only had a few seconds of protection before Kenjaku destroyed her simple domain with his domain, and he clobbered her with a sure hit attack. So for Gojo's sake, I really hope he doesn't try to rely on a simple domain because it won't be strong enough. That leaves us with one last option, the unequal domain conflict showcase, that's what I call it at least, showcased by Megumi when he was fighting Dagon. What happened in that fight was Dagon, before Megumi got there, was able to use his sure hit attacks, and that was until Megumi opened his own weaker domain within Dagon's domain. His domain was clearly weaker and smaller, and Megumi had to focus on it every instant to keep it open. So if other people hadn't been there to protect him, he would have died, obviously. But what's relevant is that he was able to stop the auto-hit mechanics even with a weaker domain than what Dagon had. So domain rules are somewhat vague, but I think the difference between the power of Megumi's domain and Dagon's domain must have been a smaller gap than the difference in power between Jogo's domain and Gojo's domain. And that's why Megumi was able to maintain partial control, and Jogo was not. So, I think unless Sukuna and Kenjaku are somehow leagues ahead of Gojo, which it doesn't seem that they are, he'll be able to erect a weaker domain, but still strong enough to protect him from their auto-hit attacks. Now, will he be able to keep it up for a long time? I'm not sure, who's to say, but I think it's certainly possible. All in all, domains are pretty much the one way where Gojo is objectively outclassed by his opponents. There's tons of ways a domain battle might pan out. All 3 might open and break their domains. Gojo might blitz one of them with pure speed of a domain opening. Gojo might get obliterated by their more refined divine technique domains. Or maybe he'll barely hang on with a weaker domain. Gojo will definitely struggle in a domain battle, but just because they have stronger domains doesn't mean it's immediately curtains for him. One last thing to consider with Gojo's techniques are red, blue, and infinity. Honestly, I think they're not strong enough to make a huge difference, even infinity, which is kind of a hot take. We've seen red kill cursed spirits a couple times, but as I mentioned earlier, it did pretty insignificant damage to Toji, and blue, it's probably about the same, although we haven't seen it against a powerful target, so we can't say for sure, but I assume they're close to equal in power. Infinity, in theory, is a crazy powerful defensive technique, but we've actually already seen its weaknesses exploited by Jogo and Hanami. So they were both able to try and land hits on Gojo, and although he avoided them in the end, he knew that their domain amplification strategy would actually work at punching through his infinity. The sequence was really sick. I actually loved this chapter, especially this expression on Jogo's face, man. I just thought it was dope. But Gojo explains what's going on after he avoids the attacks. It's sort of like a simple domain. Again, I didn't actually fully get it, I'll be honest. But basically, by making themselves slightly weaker, they're able to punch through infinity. Slightly weaker and slower and less accurate, they're able to punch through infinity. And since Kenjaku and Sukuna are super potent at barriers and domains, I think they could totally use this technique of domain amplification, and very easily, they would have a chance to punch through his infinity. So all in all, I don't think that Infinity will be the same defensive hack that it has been for him in the rest of the series. Mental game. Man, I'm not the first person to say Gojo might not be in peak form mentally. We don't know everything about his mental state, but what we do know is that the prison realm may or may not have felt like 1 year, 5 days, 100 years, 1,000 years to him, even though it was only a short time in the real world. In fact, the squad was so unsure of whether Gojo would be like mentally stable when they let him out. They had literally like barricades set up to like fight and defend if they needed to, if he was like coming out swinging for some reason. So they really thought it was a big deal, even though they were wrong in the end of the case. But in any case, they were wrong. But the fact that they were so worried about it really does show that Gojo might have been weakened by this enclosure. The next big thing is, I don't know if Gojo is willing to kill Megumi. Now, there's like a meme in the community that Gojo is like a deadbeat dad, which is hilarious, by the way. And he's definitely sent him into dangerous and even deadly situations before. But I think there's a difference between being a bad and reckless father and actually killing someone who is in the body of your son. I would be really surprised if Gojo didn't at least hesitate when trying to kill Sukuna. And that's not even mentioning killing his best friend, Geto. He already killed him once in Volume 0, and it broke his heart back then. So I can't be convinced that he's ready to kill Kenjaku again because he's in Geto's body. So all in all, I really do think that Gojo's emotion and his love for the people around him will have a large impact on the fight, which might mean he's not able to fight at full force. Narratives and the narrative of the story is also a big concern, but it's less interesting than the power scaling and the abilities, so I'll go quick. If Gojo just killed Sukuna and Kenjaku, we'd be left with a lot of untied strings. Yuji wouldn't get revenge, Angel's technique would never be used again to damage Sukuna outside of like that 1 second where she used it. We won't get to see what Kashimo's technique is. If you forgot who Kashimo is, he's this guy. And his technique was hyped up for the entire Hikari fight until he ended up not using it. Yuta won't even get to try to kill Kenjaku, which was promised ages ago. And most importantly, Maki won't be able to get killed by Sukuna to bolster Yuji's growth, which is foreshadowed in like 2 places. I'm like 95% sure I'm right, by the way. If I'm right about chapter 241 in the future, you have to subscribe. It's a rule. Anyways, jokes aside, if Gojo just kills Kenjaku and Sukuna, a lot of the story's threads will be left unfinished. So I think that narratively, Gojo probably can't kill Sukuna and Kenjaku. In-universe, I think it's certainly possible, depending on how powerful Kenjaku and Sukuna's domains are, and depending on the conditions limiting the use of his Hollow Purple and his teleportation, as well as if he's emotionally ready to kill Megumi and Geto. But my final verdict, Gojo does not want the smoke. He probably can't take them both in a fight. So, thanks for watching. If you stuck around till the end, double thanks. It was a lot of fun for me to reread some of these chapters, take a bunch of screenshots, highlight some important moments, and write out all my ideas. I haven't done something like that in a while, so I had a great time. There's some stuff I didn't touch on that I could have, like, will Megumi fight back? Will Geto fight back? But it's a long video already, so I thought I'd just leave it off here. I'm really excited for this next fight to come out. Apparently spoilers came out today, which is cringe, man. I never read the spoilers, I'll be honest. I like to have it all at once. But I've got really high expectations for this fight. Whether or not Gojo wins or loses, I'll be really happy to see the story get a little bit closer to the conclusion. Let me know what you think about my opinions, my comments, and all my ideas. Feel free to fact check me if you know I said something wrong about JJK. Some of the domain rules, some of the cursed energy rules are pretty confusing, so I could have made a mistake for sure. I did try to do everything right though, but let me know. That being said, have a great day, spread some peace and love, take good care of yourself, and bye-bye. I'll see you all next time. Have a good one.